The first thing I want to say in response to this very, very pointed question is that in some ways the most helpful thing that I can offer, I hope, is not just here's a bunch of information that will give you the reason why mathematics is important, you should spend time with it. I mean, I can and I will do that. But at the same time, I think before I even start on that answer, I want to begin by saying, I get it. I'm a person who, in my own journey, I remember feeling mathematics like that, having that attitude and that belief towards mathematics, because it's a subject that I am not naturally talented at. There are people who are like that, and they just look at an equation and they can see exactly what it means. And they're like, I've got a picture in my mind, and I can go directly to the right, the most helpful solution path. And I'm amazed by people who have that gift. I don't. I am what my teachers used to call a plodder. I would sort of like stumble my way through a solution. I'd come up with some inefficient way to get the answer, and then someone would say, hey, why didn't you do it like this, man? And I'd be like, I didn't think of doing it that way the first time. But I'd get to an answer eventually. And most importantly, the thing that I had, which has brought me, I guess, to where I am now, is I never stopped asking the question, but why and how? One of the things that is common with mathematics, and you just kind of touched on it, why does it leave a sour taste in a lot of people's proverbial mouths, is that it can seem like, I don't know, I just learned some formulas and some steps, some procedures, algorithms, and I never really comprehended why they worked. I just did them, and I had to do them over and over again until my teacher said that was enough, right? I think not knowing why something works is a pretty direct path to eventually becoming quite frustrated with something, right? All people want to understand the reason underneath. And so I guess what I would encourage, my first part of this answer, is to say, don't stop asking the question. Have that curiosity. And it's something which actually we all begin with out of the box. Like little kids, if anyone listening has younger siblings and they know how adorable but also frustrating it can be if they've got a young sort of 4 or 5-year-old person who's like, but why? But why? But why? And I'm like, after 10 of these questions, I don't know anything anymore, right? My children are in primary and high school, and so I've sort of come through a lot of that phase, but being able to say, actually, no, it's really important to not let go of that, to continue asking those questions. So I guess that's the first thing I want to say. And the other part of what I wanted to add is that mathematics does have a connection. We were talking about numeracy before. Mathematics does have a connection to all of our lives and the things that we care about. And it's just a matter of finding out what that thing is. So I know I have a lot of friends who are musicians, and several of them don't realize how mathematical it is to play, to compose, to even listen to music. One of my favorite quotes is that music is mathematics made audible. The harmonies, the rhythms, the melodies, all of it, you can think about it in numerical and quantitative ways. Whether we realize it or not is unimportant, but if we want to see mathematics as having value, then I think where it begins is seeing how it adds value to things we already care about. I love this question so much because it's a place that I know I'm going to stick up my hand and say, this is an area I am still learning so much in. I mean, I look at you and I am very jealous in a way because you've grown up in a very different culture from the one that I was in 20 years ago when I was in school. For example, just as a very simple illustration, right? When I was at school, acknowledgements of country and welcomes to country were, I don't think ever, certainly not routinely, but even on special occasions, were not done. And so even though those are a very small part of how we acknowledge and pay respect to our First Nations peoples here in Australia, you can see if we hadn't even gotten to that point, and I have learned so much from my students, my friends, my colleagues who I've gotten to listen to and to hear their stories, then you can imagine that I've come from a much further earlier on point and I'm still learning a lot. But to come back to your question, I think that probably the most important way that, in fact, Aboriginal culture and mathematics deeply inform one another. Remember I said to you before, mathematics is about patterns, right? It's also about connections. So when we talk about how things are related one to another, that an idea or a quantity or a reality doesn't just sit by itself in a vacuum, it's connected to other things. Every time I think about the things that I learn about Aboriginal society and culture, it's about the connectedness of our world. I remember, I think it was almost 10 years ago now, one of the themes for NAIDOC Week was about song lines. And I don't know if you've heard of these before, but there are these incredible sort of these dreaming tracks that crisscross land and water and connect all living things together. Now, those ideas can be expressed mathematically. You don't have to, but you can. I don't know if you guys remember, perhaps you're doing it right now, studying about things like, say, a food web, right? How the different living things in an ecosystem relate to one another. These are kind of related to things that, the Indigenous people here in Australia for tens of thousands of years have understood so deeply, and that we're just kind of scratching the surface now. So those ideas of, say, an ecosystem, we can express those mathematically in an object called a network. And for your friends or anyone listening who does mathematics standard, they know all about these. I won't go into too much depth, won't break out into a full lesson, but you can see how these are ideas that inform one another. And I could go on and on. One of the things that my friends, who's an astronomer, has taught me so much about is about the Indigenous perspective on the night sky. And of course, because First Nations cultures here in Australia have been looking at the southern hemisphere starry sky for longer than anyone. There's so much that they have to teach us about the world around us, one which we are used to understanding mathematically, but now we're just trying to bring these worlds of knowledge together. It is really funny thinking about myself as famous on YouTube because I have absolutely no street cred with my own kids. They're like, you're just dad, right? And even to students at my own school, I'm just Mr. Wu walking through the Cherrybrook Technology High School playground on yard duty. So it is still a bit weird to think of myself in those terms. So there's some deep existential questions of self-identity somewhere buried underneath there that I didn't think I turned up here for therapy, but that's okay. I guess when you ask me about what motivated me or what was the sort of click moment, I'm going to say that the click moment didn't come before I started filming. It came long after. So I began the work of filming my everyday classroom lessons not with the intent of, let's make it big on YouTube, because let's just think about this for a second. If I had a social media strategist or advisor and I went to them and I'm like, hey, I've got a great idea for making a huge YouTube channel, it's going to be maths lessons that I film in school. They'd be like, go home, that is a terrible idea, don't even start. And so there's no intent or goal to say, yep, this is going to be some grand thing. And I think, by the way, there's a lesson in there that sometimes the things that we can do, which provide the most value to the people around us, sometimes we don't know what those are until we start doing them. And then people start to say, hey, that's really amazing, that's useful, I can benefit from that. And then we sort of look around and realize, oh, where did all of you come from, right? So I began this journey in 2012 when a student of mine was very ill. So he was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. He was only about your age, actually. And one of the things that I didn't know much about pancreatic cancer at the time. I've discovered a lot more since then, but it's a very aggressive disease. People who are diagnosed tend to only have a matter of months. And this boy, he was 15 years old. And one of the things that I remember from when I was younger, not dissimilar in age to this student, was that not me, but my mother had been diagnosed with cancer when I was in year 10. And one of the things that's strange about, and I'm sure people who are listening, cancer touches so many lives. And if it hasn't touched yours directly, it's touched a friend of a relative, it's there somewhere. One of the things that touches anyone who lives with long-term chronic illness is that sometimes you just want to be normal. You don't want to be that kid who has cancer or the person whose dad is really sick and that's why you miss a lot of school, and that being the thing that shapes who you are and that everyone looks at you through that lens. And this particular student of mine, he was missing lots of school because, like I said, aggressive disease, so he began a significant treatment regime right away. And so even when he wasn't at school being treated, even when he wasn't at hospital being treated, he couldn't be at school because he was too immune compromised and he couldn't be around other people. And so what I wanted to do was to provide him some way of doing something that for him was normal, was every day, was just, this is what I always used to do before this changed my life dramatically. And even though this might not be everyone's idea of, yay, I'd love to do this, for him, it was learning. Mathematics, which was the subject I taught him, was something that I knew he was good at, that he had a gift in, and I wanted to keep cultivating that. I thought it would be so disappointing if not only was this disease taking away his health, but is also taking away things that he enjoyed learning. And so that's when I got the phone out of my pocket and I started filming it, and he was really the only person who I had in mind. And I can prove that, because if you go back and look at the early videos, they're pretty rubbish. Like, they're not good. You can tell I had no grand plans for this to go out into the world. But I guess what it taught me, what I learned was that lots of people, turns out, do actually want to understand mathematics, even though it doesn't have a reputation for that. I think there's something in all of our brains. It's like, I want to grasp why this thing is something we were all supposed to learn, and even enjoy it myself. So that point came months after I started, and here we are, still more than 10 years later. I guess one of the things that we have learned, particularly, COVID has given us a good example of this, right? Is that learning through technology, it's not ever a replacement for real face-to-face learning. One of the things I like to say sometimes to people who will ask me about why my videos are successful is that actually, you know what? Only about 50%, if even that, of the learning experience in my classroom makes its way through the lens of the camera and onto the internet, because in the lesson, I press stop, and then I go to my students and I sit beside them and I work through a problem with them, and I need to understand the thing that they're struggling with. So there's like a two-way part of the learning here that you don't see on camera. So I guess though, what I have learned is that the technology is very powerful for people to be able to go back and take charge of their own learning, right? And I think this is the story that I've heard from lots of people who said, I use your videos to do this, right? It's that it enabled them to learn further past what they might have been doing in class, but they were excited to find out, or it enabled them to go back to something that their class had moved on from. And it's like, I feel silly asking this question, but YouTube's never going to judge me, so you can always go back, it's always there. And I'll even confess that the videos there are so old now, some of them, that I've forgotten what I did in some of those lessons. And so I'll think to myself, yeah, how did I teach that? And I'll go back and I'll watch it, and it's me. I'm watching myself and I'm like, this is not a bad lesson. Who thought of doing this? Who designed this? I'm like, oh, it was me from the past. So I'm really delighted that it can still have this value to people all around the world, and even my present students still find it useful, I think.